Hello students, welcome again. Students, in today's video lecture, we want to discuss Sir Philip Sidney, who was an important poet of the Elizabethan age. But here, we are not going to analyze Sidney's contribution as a poet, but we are going to discuss Sidney as an important critique of English literature. Sidney, as I told you, was born in 1554 and died in 1586. So he lived during the second half of the 16th century. He was an Elizabethan poet. He emerged out as an important critique during these times, when he published an apology for poetry. This is the title of his critical document, which was written in 1580 but was posthumously published. Posthumously means after his death. It was first published in 1595 after his death in 1586. Many critics consider an apology for poetry as an important landmark in the literary criticism in English literature. It has been considered as an illuminating piece of literary criticism. David Deches, he said that this essay is one of the outstanding performances in English criticism and one which started a new phase in critical history. So according to David Deches, this critical essay written by Sidney, An Apology for Poetry, it begins a new era of literary criticism in England. Now, when we read this critical document, An Apology for Poetry, we can divide the whole discussion into three major sections. Number one, commendation of dignity of poetry. Here, in the first section, Sidney tries to he tries to commend the dignity of poetry. He wants to establish poetry as a valuable art. Number two is the defense of poetry. We know that during the 16th century, there were some scholars who went against the poets and poetry, just like Plato. So Sidney wanted to defend poetry against all the charges against poets and poetry. And section number three, here we find Sidney's review of contemporary poetry and drama. How Sidney evaluates the Elizabethan poetry and Elizabethan drama. Now, as I told you, Sidney was not originally a critic. He was compelled to become a critic. Why? Because it was Stephen Gusen, who was one of the scholars during this Elizabethan age. He published one essay, School of Abuse, in 1579. Remember this title and date, School of Abuse in 1579, written by Stephen Gusen. Now Stephen Gusen, he wrote so many things against the poets and poetry. And Sidney was himself a great poet of his times. So naturally, Sidney could not tolerate these things. He could not tolerate anyone who speaks against the poets and against the poetry. And important thing is that when Stephen Gusen published this School of Abuse, he dedicated this essay to Sir Philip Sidney, who was an important poet. So Sidney, who was a worshipper, who was a lover of poetry, he could not tolerate this and he decided to reply the charges of Stephen Gusen, and he decided to place poetry on the highest platform, on the highest pedestal of esteem and honor. So this is how, Sidney, though he was a poet, he was compelled to write criticism in the defense of poets and poetry. So now let's begin with the first section, that is commendation of dignity of poetry. Poetry must be respected, must be honored. Why? Number one, because of its antiquity. According to Sidney, the art of writing poetry is one of the most ancient arts. Okay, and that's why we must place poetry, we must put poetry on the highest level of honor. His first claim of poetry is its antiquity. He believed that poetry is the mother of knowledge and it is the first nurse of knowledge. Poetry, according to Sidney, gives us knowledge. Poetry, according to Sidney, enlightens the mankind, and that's why, and poetry has been doing this job since time immemorial. Okay, since so many ages, and poetry is an antique ancient art, and that's why we must respect poetry. Another reason why we must honor and respect and worship poetry, the another reason is its universality. Poetry is universal, and in all cultures, in all times, poetry has been respected. Say, for example, among the Romans, the poets were considered Vates, V-A-T-E-S. V-A-T-E-S. Poets were called Vates, poets were called diviners, okay, foreseers or prophets. So these words, which are generally given to the holy saints or gods, such words were used for the poets by the Roman people. If you examine the Greek culture, in Greece also, the poets were called makers, the poets were called creators, and gods were also known as makers and creators. So poets are as good as gods, according to Sidney, as generally believed in Greek culture. So, poets, according to Sidney, they are the creators. They transform nature. Okay, the world of nature is brazen, but the poets only deliver golden. Sidney said that this world is made of brass, and brass has no value. But it is the job of the poet to change this brazen world into a golden world. So the poets deliver something which is golden. Okay, so that's why Sidney says that we must respect and worship the poets and poetry. Now, Sidney wants to define poetry. What is poetry according to Sir Philip Sidney? He says that poetry is an art of imitation. So here we can remember Plato and Aristotle. Plato also said that poetry is an art. Aristotle also believed that every art is an imitation. So poetry, according to Sidney, is an art of imitation a speaking picture with this end to teach and delight. Poetry, according to Sidney, is a speaking picture. The poet's job is to create the visual pictures before the eyes of the readers. So, here perhaps Sidney wants to say that the poets must make use of imagery, visual imagery, so that the whole picture comes before our mental eyes when we read that poetry. And towards the last part of the definition, Sidney talks about the function of poetry. He says that the primary function of poetry is to teach and delight. Poetry teaches the readers and poetry must delight the readers. So this is how he defines poetry. Sidney also expresses his different views on different types of poetry. Mainly, he speaks about three types of poetry. The first one is the poetry which presents the world in a better way. Okay, so to present a better world is one type of poetry which teaches the readers, which pleases the readers. The second type of poetry is highly philosophic kind of poetry. Okay, say for example the poetry written by Virgil, the Greek poet, Lucretius, Cato, and so many others, ancient poets, their poetry fall into this category which is known as philosophic poetry, and the main aim of such poetry is delightful teaching. The third kind of poetry, according to Sidney, is the poetry of life imaginatives. Now, this poetry is the poetry which is the right kind of poetry, which is based on this human life, human nature, presented with the imagination of the poets. Okay, so it is known as the poetry of life imaginatives. Okay, this kind of poetry is written by the Veds. They imitate life to delight and teach the readers. And this third kind of poetry may be further subdivided into heroic poetry, tragic poetry, comic poetry, satirical poetry, elegiac poetry, pastoral poetry, and so many others. This third kind of poetry is the right kind of poetry. Then, after discussing three types of poetry, Sidney wants to prove that poetry is much higher than philosophy and history. Here, there is a kind of comparison presented by Sidney, the comparison between poetry and philosophy, and the comparison between poetry and history, and he says that what is the job of a philosopher? The job of a philosopher is to present how the world should be. Okay? What an ideal world should be. And what is the job of a poet? The job of a poet is to present the world as it is and to present the world as it should be. If you examine history, what does the history do? History talks about what exactly was or what exactly is. So, history talks about what is and philosophy talks about what should be. But poetry is one step ahead. Why? Because Sidney says that poetry not only presents what exactly is, but at the same time, poetry presents what should be. So that's why what poetry does, philosophy cannot. What poetry does, history cannot. So, history deals with what is or what was, and philosophy deals with what should be. But poetry is a mixture of both, and that's why poetry is much higher than philosophy and history. Okay, and that's why he says that the poet indeed is the right philosopher. Now, as I told you in the beginning, Stephen Gusen published The School of Abuse in 1579, and an apology of poetry written by Sidney was first written in 1580. And here he defends poetry against different charges laid down by Stephen Gusen. Gusen mainly laid down three charges. He said that we must reject poetry because poetry is unprofitable, because poets are liars, and because poetry is a nurse of abuse. But Sidney replies these charges one by one. Number one, Stephen Gusen said that poetry is unprofitable. But Sidney said that poetry is not unprofitable. Writing poetry is a profitable activity. Why? Because teaching virtue is the aim of all learning, and poetry does this very well. Poetry teaches virtue to the society, and that's why poetry is not an unprofitable activity. The second charge was that poets are liars, but Sidney says that poets are not liars, historians are liars. History affirms that this was exactly what I saw and what I examined. Poets never affirm anything. Okay, the poet does not say that this is what life is. The poet presents the life as he finds. Whether to accept it or not, that depends upon the reader. It is open for the reader. Okay, so he never affirms. So when you never affirm anything, you are not telling a lie. So poetry never tells a lie. The third charge was that poetry abuses man's intelligence, man's wit. He says that poetry does not abuse man's wit, it is man's wit which abuses poetry. Actually, during the 16th century, during the Elizabethan age, there were some poets who were writing immoral kind of poetry, not good kind of poetry. Bad poetry was written, and that's why Stephen Gusen says that poetry abuses our mind, our intelligence, our wit. But Sidney says that it is the man's wit which abuses poetry. Bad people write bad poetry. Poetry originally is not bad. Okay, poetry originally is a good activity. Writing poetry is a good activity. So poetry does not abuse man's wit. Man's wit sometimes abuses poetry. Now, in the third section, towards the end part of the apology for poetry, here Sidney presents his own review of contemporary poetry and drama. What are Sidney's views on poetry? He said that ideal poetry must have three basic principles, and they are art, imitation, and practice. Okay, the poet must be a great artist. The poet must have the art of imitation. He must know how to copy well. And number three, a great poet must do much practice of writing poetry. These three things are the three basic principles of writing poetry, and Sidney admires Chaucer as a poet, Spenser as a poet, and Earl of Surrey as a poet, and he believed that all these three basic principles are found among these three poets. Regarding tragedy, Sidney was a classicist. Sidney points out at two major serious defects of the Elizabethan drama, and they are the neglect of unity of time and place. Okay, he said that there are some writers like Christopher Marlowe, like William Shakespeare, they violated the unity of time and place, which Sidney did not like. He also goes against the mixture of tragedy and comedy. He said that Sidney believed that if you are writing a tragedy, it must be a complete tragedy. And if you are writing a comedy, it must be a complete comedy. The mixture of tragedy and comedy is not allowed by Sidney. William Shakespeare wrote Merchant of Venice, which is a mixture of tragedy and comedy. Sidney was against all such things. So, two important major defects he finds in the Elizabethan drama. About comedy, Sidney's views on comedy, the most significant view on comedy is that his distinction between delight and humor. Sidney says that delight and laughter should be effectively combined in comedy. Okay, the laughter must be innocent laughter. He says that evil and vicious things should not be the subject matter of comedy. Sometimes we laugh at some people's drawbacks, which hurts somebody. According to Sidney, comedy must arouse laughter and comedy must delight the readers, but at the same time, it must not hurt anyone. Okay, so the proper raw material of comedy is to be found in the human weaknesses, no doubt, but these weaknesses are presented in such a manner that it is harmless. It should not harm, it should not hurt anyone. And regarding Sidney's views on poetry, Sidney was so much disappointed and unhappy to see that England did not produce different versatile kind of poetry except some lyrical songs. The whole Elizabethan period is the period of lyrical songs. He says that regarding the use of meter, he says that only wearing a black gown does not make you an advocate. Okay, so only making use of rhyme and meter does not make you a poet. A true poet must have three basic principles: art, imitation and practice. Okay, only meter does not make you a great poet. He believes that meter and rhyme, no doubt, they have some divine force. They make your poetry a beautiful poetry, but the poet must give more attention to each syllable as per the dignity of the subject matter. Okay, he adds that he also adds that the sound and sense must go together, must agree with each other. So sound and sense means thought and meter must go side by side. So this is how he has expressed his views on contemporary Elizabethan poetry. Now here we come to the end of this discussion. At the end we can say that Sidney's apology for poetry begins a new phase of critical theory in English literature. There is Sidney, we can say, is a nice amalgamation, a nice mixture of a classicist and a romanticist. Sidney he believed in classical rules, but at the same time he believes in liberty. In his rejection of tragicomedy, in his insistence on three unities of time, place and action, he seems to be a classicist. Okay, but on the other hand, when he talks about the use of imagination, when in his idea of making a more beautiful world, the world is brazen, but the poets only deliver golden. How does a poet make it golden, make the life golden, make this world golden? By the use of imagination. So in his discussion of the use of imagination, on the use of meter and rhyme, he seems to be a romanticist. At the end, David Deches rightly said these lines. He said that we might remember that from his day to ours, from 16th century till present times, the vast majority of readers of imaginative literature have taken substantially his view and have generally applied it with less cunning and sensitivity. David Deches wants to say that right from 16th century onwards, all the scholars, other scholars of literature, they have applied Sidney's views while analyzing the poetry and drama. So we are indebted to Sidney as a critique. His contribution to English criticism is indeed commendable, and we must appreciate him as a great critic of the Elizabethan age. So here we come to the end. Thank you for watching. If you have any doubts or questions, do write to me in the comment section of this channel, and please share this video among all your friends and classmates. Thank you.